Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining us in today's webinar, Unprocessed, What Your Diet is Doing to Your Brain. My name is Dr. Sundar Samadhi, and I'm a Research Associate at the Department of Health Sciences at the University of York, where a lot of my work focuses on improving access to healthy and sustainable meals to children at school through the Fix Our Food programme. So a few technical notes before I introduce our speaker. So subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom on your screen. And should you have any technical issues, such as a loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. If you are watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. So this is available throughout the event, so questions can be posted at any time. And please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. So now to introduce our speaker. Kimberley Wilson is a chartered psychologist, author, and visiting lecturer working in private practice in central London. She's a former governor of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Mental Health Trust and the former chair of the British Psychological Society's Training Committee in Counselling Psychology. Kimberley's first book, How to Build a Healthy Brain, published by Yellow Kite in 2020, explored how to look after both physical and mental well-being. She hosts Stronger Minds, a podcast on topics such as food, lifestyle, psychology, and mental health. She's appeared on various TV shows, including Good Morning Britain, and was a Great British Bake Off finalist. And today she'll be discussing why poor nutrition must be recognised as a social injustice and why action must be taken, which is the subject of her latest book, Unprocessed, What Your Diet is Doing to Your Brain. Kimberley, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for giving up, I think, your lunchtime. I will try to make this session as informative as possible for you, which might mean I talk a little bit fast, but I will try to keep everything understandable and intelligible. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'll leave time at the end for questions. And as luck would have it, on the first sunny day of the year, someone's just started drilling outside, but hopefully you can hear me and we'll be able to get through this. Okay, and essentially what I want you to take away from this session is an understanding of the importance of nutrition, not just for physical health. I think we're very, very aware of that by now. We understand the importance for heart health and cancer risk and all of those sorts of things. But for me, and from my perspective as a psychologist, the brain is always left out of this conversation. We're never really thinking about actually this organ, this most important organ in my body, everything that I am, my hopes, my dreams, my ambitions, my ability to concentrate and focus and sustain attention actually needs looking after as well. It needs nourishing, it needs protecting, and we don't have an education on that. We don't have information about that. So that is what I want to give you today. Alrighty, let's get into it. Let's talk about food and the brain. So, I'm sure you're all lovely. Everybody here has been lovely to me so far this morning. And I say this with love, and I include myself, but you're all fatheads. And by that, what I mean is that the brain is the second fattiest organ in the body. It's second only to adipose tissue, fat tissue itself. And so fat is an absolutely essential kind of structural and functional compound in the brain. So if I were to take your brain and leave it out in the sun and draw out all the water, about 60% of that dry weight of your brain would be fats. And then a good chunk of those fats would be a special kind of long chain omega-3 fat called DHA, so the docosahexaenoic acid. So you will have heard about the omega-3s. And DHA is kind of the last step in this very long process. So you have your linolenic acid, so other acids, and then it goes through these different steps with enzymes, this kind of long ladder of processes, and then down at the bottom is DHA. And so our brain really, really relies on this fat for its entire function. And that's really weird. And it's really weird because, as I've just said, it's really quite hard to make. There are other fats that are very similar in structure to DHA and that are more abundant, but your brain just says, no, I don't want those. No, thank you. You can keep those. I will wait for the DHA. And what's really interesting about that is that you would think then, if we're waiting for this fact that we'd be able to make it quite well. And actually, that's not true either. We're very poor at converting, we can't synthesize it from scratch in the body at all. And we're also very poor at converting it, doing those different levels. And so it's very odd that our brains, these very important organs, would really rely so heavily on this particular nutrient. And what that tells us, that imbalance, that kind of, this nutrient is really, really important, but we can't make it. What it tells us is that actually, for a long period of time, that nutrient was abundant enough in our diets for our bodies to not have to worry about it. The same sort of thing happened with vitamin C. We used to, as mammals, most other mammals can make their own vitamin C. Only us, other primates and guinea pigs can't make our own vitamin C. And what they think happened was that there was a period in our evolution where actually we were eating enough plants, enough fruits and vegetables, that when that genetic mishap happened, which turned off our ability to make vitamin C, it didn't matter, because we were getting enough vitamin C in through our diets that we didn't lose out in any way. And so there's this kind of idea that DHA is so important for our brains because at some point in our evolutionary history, there was enough of it in our diets for it not to matter that we didn't convert it very well. And when I tell you that it's important, I want to show you what I mean so you can really picture it. So these are brain cells. They're not human brain cells because ethics wouldn't let us do that, but these are mouse brain cells. And I will explain everything that you can see on your screen. So they are mouse brain cells, mouse pups, so mouse babies, from the part of the brain that's called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is really the seat of memory. It's the part that coordinates your memory, takes things from short-term memory, puts them into long-term memory so you can remember that thing you did on the first day of school, or remember the name of your best friend at uni, that kind of thing. So really important for memory, and it's really the area of the brain that is damaged most extensively in Alzheimer's disease. So when we think hippocampus, we want to think learning and memory. So we have these brain cells from these mouse pups, and these long kind of branches you see there are processes, they're dendrites, and those are the connections in the brain. And essentially, broadly, what we want to see is more connections, because it's like having more bricks to build a house with. You're going to be able to build a more stable structure with the more connections, the more bricks that you have. And what you can see here is a difference of 50%. So the one on the right-hand side of your screen has a 50% reduction in the number of connections that brain cell has been able to produce. And the only difference between the kind of lifespans of these brain cells is that the one on the right, the mother of that pup during pregnancy didn't have enough omega-3 in her diet, and on the left, she did. So this is about the availability of omega-3 in the maternal diet and the impact on the baby's brain. So when the mother has enough omega-3, her baby's brain has more capacity to build these connections. And what you should be saying to me as very sophisticated viewers and audience is, that's all well and good, thank you so much, but I'm not a mouse, so why should I care? And actually, we see a proxy of this in humans. So what we see is, and of course, we can't deliberately deprive human mothers of omega-3 fatty acids. But what you can do is take women who say, oh, I eat a lot of fish during my pregnancy, or I don't eat fish at all. Compare their blood levels. So you take a little bit of, you take a blood sample from there, could be a finger prick, and you see how much omega-3 she has in her bloodstream and her blood cells, and then you scan the baby's brain. And that's what they've done in quite a few studies now. And what you find is that this kind of same thing that we see with the mouse studies, which is when mothers have a higher intake of omega-3 in her diet, the baby's brain has a larger overall volume and larger regional volumes and more connectivities between the two hemispheres of the brain. And importantly, these differences seem to be independent of other factors that can affect health and development, such as race, ethnicity, education, and income. And so that's in babies, so one-month-old term babies, but we also see the same thing happening in children later on in life. So this is the same kind of effect. So low maternal omega-3 during pregnancy was associated with reduced total grey and white matter. So those are the brain cells and the connections between them in late childhood, which is between the ages of kind of 9 to 11. So we see these long-term associations between maternal diet, what the mother is eating, and the effect on the child's brain. And this is what I mean when I say I really want more people to understand the importance of these things, and largely for our health systems, for our governments to take this more seriously, because what we're talking about is really the health and the brain function of the next generations. And this is a kind of final step in that, which is to say, yes, now we've outlined how important this nutrient is. Actually, fewer than 5% of children in the UK, and I think this was done back in 2017 or thereabouts, hardly anyone, essentially, fewer than 5% of children are meeting the recommendations of oily fish intake in order to feed their still developing brains. A huge chunk of brain development happens during pregnancy, but of course, it still continues quite rapidly in what we call the first 1,000 days, which is kind of conception through to about the age of 2 or 3. So we have a population of adults who aren't eating enough oily fish. We know that from government nutrition surveys. And then we've got children who aren't eating enough of them either. And I suppose the broader question is, well, how might this relate to some of the things that we're seeing in terms of increased rates of developmental conditions, increased rates of psychiatric conditions, and just kind of a poorer psychological and neurological outlook that seems to be a trend. There are other things that factor in for that, including things like any of you who follows me on Instagram, the prevalence inflation. But I think we need to think more broadly about how we're protecting, feeding and developing the brains of our next generations. All right, so that's omega-3 fatty acids. I'm going to take you through a few more key nutrients that perhaps you will have heard of, some of them you might not have, but I think are really important for us to be thinking about. So, some more brain scans. So this is a brain scan of a 14-month-old baby girl. And I've circled in red this area of particular, that kind of dark patch there. Now, essentially, that's not the only one. So you can see one at the top of the screen. It's about 1 centimetre at the front, where the front of the brain connects with the skull, and some on the opposite side. And then that big X in the middle, that big X should be there, but it shouldn't be as big. And essentially that's the area that I've circled really shouldn't be there at all. All of these dark patches are what's called atrophy. And they're areas of the brain that have begun to shrink back and essentially die in the brain. And what happened was that this baby girl was brought to hospital, and she was unable to make voluntary movements. She had involuntary movements of her eyes. She was kind of listless. And of course, when a baby is brought in, and she was, brought in by her parents, and the parents were very anxious. When a baby is brought in like that, obviously people are very concerned about what's happened. And brain scans like this are very, very worrying. And so the thinking is, well, has she had some sort of head injury? Perhaps is there some sort of issue at home? Is there some sort of trauma or something? Actually, none of those things were the case. This brain damage was caused by the deficiency of a single nutrient. It was caused by a deficiency in B12. And B12 is, and I'll talk you through the other B vitamins, but essentially the entire suite, the entire family of B vitamins are so important for the brain that deficiency shows up as neurological symptoms. And in this case, it was a single nutrient. And the reason that this baby was so deprived of this nutrient, was so deficient in this nutrient, was that she was conceived by and then exclusively breastfed by a mother who was vegetarian and not supplementing, because we get our B12 from animal foods. It's very easy to supplement, and I think on the front page of the vegan website they will say, if you're switching to a vegan diet, make sure you've got a reliable source of B12. But there are 40 cases like this in the research literature demonstrating that even though this is well-known information, there are still cases where, even with the best intentions, some brains are being deprived because nutrients are missing from the diet. The good news is that with intravenous B12 treatment, the baby's brain was able to recover. So that's really important and very kind of encouraging. What we do know, though, is that the longer that someone is left in that level of deficiency, the harder it is for the brain to recover. So it's really important for anyone, if you're thinking of taking something out of your diet, switching up your diet, that you really think about what nutrients might be lost or reduced with those changes. Because I think quite often when we're thinking about dietary changes, particularly when we think about meat or fish, we tend to think iron and protein. And you think, well, if I can get my iron from somewhere else, and if I can get my protein from somewhere else, I'll be fine. But actually, there are other key nutrients that are in these foods that you just need to be aware of and need to be thinking about. And therefore, if you're going to cut certain things out of your diet for personal, religious, lifestyle, whatever reasons, making sure you're covering your neurological nutritional bases. So the rest of those B vitamins, just so that you have a sense and how they link to neurological symptoms of deficiency, I've popped them there, including I've highlighted and bolded the ones that are really linked to kind of personality things and things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with diet. You know, if someone walks into my clinic and they say, oh, well, I'm feeling depressed, I'm feeling anxious, and I punch somebody in the face, I might start asking questions about their relationship with their mother. And actually, there might be an indication that there's something happening here, maybe, for example, with their nutritional status. We know, for example, that when older people present perhaps at their GP or for a neuro assessment, with memory problems, forgetfulness, that kind of thing, they first have to be screened for B12 deficiency before an assumption is made that they might have dementia, because B12 deficiency at its extreme can mimic dementia. So these nutrients are really, really important. And we know, for example, that B12, B9, and B6 help to recycle an amino acid in the brain called homocysteine, high levels of which are associated with heart disease, but also an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. So they help to convert this homocysteine into these more helpful nutrients and precursors to antioxidants. And again, that's just about having sufficient B vitamins in your diet, in your normal dietary intake, just to make sure everything is running smoothly. Okay, here's a nutrient that perhaps you'll be less aware of, unless, of course, maybe you're working in midwifery, you work with pregnant women, and this is iodine. And iodine, according to the World Health Organization, so the World Health Organization calls it the leading cause of preventable brain damage worldwide. The leading cause of preventable brain damage worldwide. What we know about iodine is that it's absolutely essential for kick-starting the development of the brain at conception and in an early pregnancy. People who grow up in areas of low iodine intake can have permanently suppressed IQs of up to 15 points. That's how closely associated iodine is with brain development and IQ. Very, very severe deficiencies in iodine led to a condition that used to be called cretinism. It's now called congenital hypothyroidism. But essentially, it's a very severe impairment in physical and brain development. So we have this nutrient here. And this one, iodine, is found most abundantly in seaweed. Seaweed is an incredibly rich source, but seaweed, fish, seafood, dairy, a little bit in eggs, and some in meat. So again, we're kind of towards, other than seaweed, we're thinking some animal foods. And in fact, if we ate more seaweed, we'd probably be fine. Oh, and iodized salt. In the US, in the central states, when they started iodizing salt, they got essentially a decade's worth of IQ improvement in the space of a couple of years. So we have this nutrient. The World Health Organization knows about it. Now you know about it. And it's actually fairly easily remedied and quite cheaply remedied. And what you're seeing on your screen here are these associations, very clear correlations between maternal iodine, so testing the amount of iodine in a mother's urine during pregnancy, and then correlating that to her child's IQ. So reading accuracy, verbal IQ, total IQ, reading comprehension. And you see these very clear associations. When we think about iodine deficiency, we tend to think about areas of the world like India, maybe back during the First and Second World Wars, the central states of America. Actually, 67% of UK women are iodine deficient. So even in a wealthy country where we have had for a long time access to the information from the World Health Organization, recommendations, preconception nutrients, still deficiency in iodine is the norm for pregnant women in the UK. Okay, so you will have seen lots in the, and I have contributed to this to an extent, lots talking about the Western diet, ultra-processed foods, what's going on, what they're all about, why they're so terrible for us, because what the headlines have been saying pretty consistently is this category of foods, and in the book I give you a very clear outline of what it is, what this category of foods is. I suppose the very, very, very shorthand is that this category of foods are typically ready to eat, ready to heat, and where there is a process or an ingredient that you can't do at home. So if the ingredient on your bread is dimethylglycerols or fatty acids, and you can't get that at Sainsbury's, then it's likely to fall into the category of ultra-processed foods. Now, there's lots of kind of blurry boundaries about some ultra-processed foods that are high in fiber tend to not be too as well associated with the negative outcomes, but that's a broad shorthand. And essentially, this definition was put together coming, I think, to about kind of 15 years ago by a research group in Brazil. And what they were able to do is to kind of categorize these foods. And that's what's led to this new sweep of research and headlines that you're seeing. So ultra-processed foods and the Western diet in general, and the Western diet is one that tends to be higher in sugar, higher in salt, saturated fat, and low in fruits, vegetables, and fiber, tends to be associated with poorer health outcomes, whether we're talking about increased risk of heart disease, increased risk of certain cancers, and again, from my perspective, it's associated with increased risk of neurodegeneration and dementia. So the big question is why. We have these correlations, but the big argument between the scientists is, well, what is accounting for all of these problems? What is it about these foods in particular, as well as the amounts in which they might be consumed, that seems to be the problem? And so we're going to do a very whistle-stop tour of what the problem might be. Okay, what's the problem? Biscuits are delicious. What's the problem? Okay, so the first question, and perhaps the most obvious idea, is simply that this category of foods, UPF, overlaps to a degree of 95% with foods that are already high in fat, salt, and sugar. That's HFSS. So these foods tend to be energy dense, and because they're energy dense, which means, there's less water in them, there's less fiber in them. So it's more, so the energies, you get more calories per gram. Because of that, it's just easy for us to overconsume them. And if we overconsume them, it's easiest for us to put on a little bit of weight. And when your weight goes up, when your adiposity, it's a scientific term, goes up, that the fat around your belly, then you get this increased risk of insulin resistance or high blood sugar and type 2 diabetes. We know that type 2 diabetes and hypoglycemia, so high blood sugar that is just under the threshold for diabetes, or what might be called pre-diabetes, increase your risk of dementia by at least twofold. And there's a growing body of evidence that's suggesting that insulin resistance, so again, this hypoglycemia, seems to be associated with an increased risk in mood disorders as well. So the first question, and maybe the simplest answer to the problem of UPF, is maybe it's just that they're high in fat, salt, and sugar, and we know that these foods are unhealthy for us anyway. It could be that. It could be that they interfere with quite an old established process in the body, which is called nutrient sensing. So we have some inbuilt preferences for a few key flavors. Sugar is the big one. Babies are born with a sweet, well, they don't have teeth, sweet tongue. So babies are born with a preference for sweet foods and an avoidance of bitter foods. And that's really important. When we were on the savannah, on that kind of proverbial savannah, energy was fairly hard to come by. And that sweet taste was an indication of two things. One, that carbohydrates are here, energy is here, your brain runs on glucose, so that was a really important piece of information. And also that basically everything sweet in nature is safe to eat. Which is really, there's only kind of 2 or 3 exceptions to that. Sweet tasting things are safe to eat. So that sweet flavor becomes a really important piece of information for your brain and body. It tells your brain and body, this is safe, this has energy, let's go. Salt provides us with sodium, which is really important for the running of your nerves. That umami flavor, that recently discovered 5th taste of amino acids, it tells us that protein and amino acids are there. Of course, protein is important for growth and development, but also your amino acids build your neurotransmitters. They build those chemical signalers in your brain. Sour is an indication perhaps that vitamin C is around, and that bitter taste, that bitter flavor that babies kind of pull away from, is associated with a group of compounds called alkaloids. In this category are things like caffeine, theobromine, that's found in chocolate, also cocaine is an alkaloid. But the point is that these are substances that are psychoactive. They have an effect on the brain and they are toxic. And so that bitter flavor is an indication, oh, perhaps we shouldn't be eating this. Maybe this one we leave off the menu this time. So we have this evolved mechanism for seeing a relationship between the flavor of something and the energy and the nutrients that it's given us. You also have taste receptors, similar to the ones in your tongue, in your gut. So in your small intestine, they're called neuropods, and they kind of coordinate what's happening in your tongue to what's happening in your gut. So when you taste something sweet and it goes in, and then it starts being digested and broken down, and then those taste receptors, those neuropods in your gut, are kind of tasting what's happening in your gut and correlating that information, and then sending that information back up to your brain, so that your brain can then say, okay, we've tasted something sweet, we've had an increase in blood glucose, we now have this corroborating information from our neuropods, we've taken on enough energy, we can stop eating. So your brain combines all of this information that's coming from the body to control your appetite and to carefully balance energy that goes out with energy that comes in. And so the whole point of this is a lot of ultra-processed foods will have artificial flavors, aromas, and added amino acids. So a chicken or bacon flavored crisp will have amino acids which promise added amino acids which promise that amino acids are going to be there, but actually they don't deliver. And so there's a question that's still being kind of worked out in the research, which is, well, if the tongue is promising something to the brain, which then the gut says doesn't arrive, what sense does your brain make of that? And is some of our difficult, overconsumption of these foods, is it about the kind of level of confusion that the brain is going through when the tongue is promised something that actually the food doesn't deliver? So that's an ongoing question, but it's really interesting when it comes to things like food or eating addiction. Again, that tends to be with this category of foods and not so much with whole foods. Some people do overconsume kind of more natural or home cooked foods, but predominantly over 90% of people who struggle with compulsive eating tends to be with this category of foods. And so there's an interesting question, and as I say, it's still a question and it's still being worked out as to what is being overridden, what is about these foods which might cause the body to override these very long established evolutionary mechanisms for managing appetite. Okay, could it be, so moving on, could it be about what's happening in the gut? So we've been talking a lot about the gut microbiome recently. The gut microbiome is basically an endocrine organ. It makes hormones, it makes B vitamins, it makes precursors to neurotransmitters. It's a very busy, hardworking organ. And let me just double check the time. Okay, we're good. And that's all fantastic. However, in some animal trials and in some cell cultures, so where they take human gut cells, put them in a dish and grow them, and then apply emulsifiers, what you get is a shift in the function of the gut barrier. So here, when you're on that part of your screen that says normal tight junction, those two blue bands are layers of mucus. There are two layers of gel or mucus, and they help to protect your gut lining. And the bacteria live on that top pale blue one. And if you're eating enough fiber and nothing is hurting your gut, then all is good. They live there happily, doing their job, helping us all out. However, what's been found in, again, as I say, some of the animal trial and the cell culture studies is that some of our common emulsifiers degrade that mucus layer. They can shift the balance of the microbes, and they can shift the microbes' gene expression in a more pro-inflammatory way. And what then happens is that lovely tight function, that tight connection that you're supposed to have in those cells that line your gut can open up a little bit. And when that happens, the bacteria, as you can see on that, when it says leaky and inflamed, that bacteria can cross over into the bloodstream. That's the line at the bottom. And in your bloodstream, they encounter white blood cells. And your white blood cells are there constantly on the lookout for intruders. And gut bacteria are intruders when they're not in the gut. You know, when they cross over and then they're in the bloodstream, that's when they become problematic. And that's when we get this launching of an inflammatory response. So one of the questions in relation to why might UPFs be less good for us is it something about the content and the function of emulsifiers and how they're affecting the gut and the gut microbiome in this kind of, we think, pro-inflammatory way that is part of the issue. And similarly, this is not a mistake. It's the same picture because it's a similar function. When you're eating enough fiber, one of the byproducts, I told you they make B vitamins and neurotransmitter precursors. One of the other class of compounds that your gut bugs make are called short chain fatty acids. So the omega-3s are long chain fatty acids, but they're also short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids are really interesting. Firstly, they feed these cells that line your gut and keep them nice and tight and happy and protective. But secondly, they can diffuse into the bloodstream, so they can cross into the bloodstream, circulate in your bloodstream, and get to the brain. And what they do when they get to the brain is the same thing they do in the gut, which is to protect the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier is this very selective membrane that stops anything toxic from your blood from crossing into your brain, where it can cause all sorts of havoc. I think of the blood-brain barrier as a bouncer outside a nightclub. Like it's there to keep all the troublemakers out. It lets the people, if your name's down, you can come in, but if your name's not down, you're not coming in. So your blood-brain barrier is there to make sure only the right nutrients, water, a few amino acids, some glucose, can get into the brain, and everything else stays on the outside. But we know, again, that a poor diet and other things, excess alcohol consumption, can lead to this permeability in the BBB, and that can lead to neuroinflammation. And so there's a question, and this isn't necessarily just strictly around ultra-processed foods, but diets that are low in fiber, do they contribute to this degradation, this kind of breaking down in the integrity of your blood-brain barrier? And could that be associated with some of the things, the associations that we're seeing? Because what we do know is that a breakdown in the BBB is one of the upstream, it's one of the earliest things that happens when we're looking at Alzheimer's disease and dementia. It's one of the first key markers of this neurodegeneration. So could it be that? Could it be the texture of the food? So one of the things we know about ultra-processed foods is that they're much softer. So they're nutrient dense that I mentioned earlier on, but they're also much softer than, say, a smooth peanut butter that has added sugar and palm oil and salt is softer than a handful of peanuts, as a simple, crude example. And because it's softer than a handful of peanuts, it's going to be easier to have a spoonful of peanut butter than it is. I'm not I'm not hating on peanut butter, it's just an example, than it is to have a handful of peanuts, right? And so this is kind of one of the big landmark studies that has indicated that something about the very texture, the nature of the food itself, has something to do with these kind of negative outcomes. So this was an inpatient study, which got 20 patients, and they got them participants really, into a lab, and they stayed in the lab for a fortnight. And they had one of two diets. Now, the diets, which is really important for our understanding of the mechanism, is that the diets were matched for calories, sugar, fat, fiber content, and micronutrients, vitamins and minerals. The only difference was the level of processing. You were allowed to eat as much of them as you liked. And what the researchers did was to just measure how much people were eating, weighing how much they were eating of these foods. And what they found was that in these otherwise nutritionally matched diets, those who were eating the ultra-processed version were consuming 500 more calories per day compared to the minimally processed people. And then they had obviously body weight changes that correlated to that increased intake of calories. And so there's something about that. Is it something about just the speed with which we know that the speed in which you eat is really closely correlated to how many calories you take in. And of course, the softer something is, the faster you can take on calories. So is it this? Is it simply that these foods are so soft and easy to consume that we tend to eat more of them at a single sitting? Marketing. Ironically, there is no image on this when I'm talking about marketing, but one of the issues around these foods is it simply that they're so heavily marketed to us, you know, that we see them everywhere. We see them on bus stops and billboards and on TV. We hear them in between our podcasts. We see them online. We find them on the back of our bus tickets. These foods are everywhere. And what we know psychologically about being presented with information about food is that the more often you see it, the more positive a view you develop about it, you know, the kind of more liking of that brand, and the more desire you will build up for that food. So when you're constantly being shown images of a delicious crispy piece of chicken and fries delicately sprinkled with salt and a burger with crisp lettuce, what are those what we call food cues in the environment doing to your brain's understanding of what you need and what you want, and when you next feel hungry, what you're going to desire? And I suppose I would simply say, if it didn't work, if the marketing didn't work, manufacturers, food industry wouldn't spend so much money on it. Or is it, and we're getting close to the end now, is it simply, from my perspective, you know, I've spoken about a few nutrients that are really important for the brain, but of course, all the nutrients are really important for the brain. Is it simply that they are almost by definition lower in key micronutrients? Because as soon as you process something, you lose something. When you process a whole grain, so whole grain wheat into white flour, you lose something like 80% of the magnesium. And magnesium is really important for kind of 600 different enzyme processes in your body, including ones in the brain. And we know that there's an inverse correlation. So the higher your intake of ultra-processed foods, the lower your status of all of these nutrients. Vitamin A, B3, 6, and 12, the ones that I told you help to recycle that homocysteine, vitamin C, D, E, a bunch of minerals, and the omega-3s. And is it simply that we've got full bellies, but hungry brains? Should I do this one? Should we skip this one? I'll do it very quickly. I'll do it very quickly. A really interesting study, kind of hilarious. What they did was to get a group of people together, 110 healthy people, and to put them on a proxy of a Western diet for a week. And that Western diet was, please eat 2 Belgian waffles 4 days a week. So kind of trying to mimic a sweet breakfast, like a sweet cereal that you might have, and then have 2 takeaways that week. And since nearly 80% of Brits say I have at least 1 takeaway a week, it's not wildly unusual. It's not a kind of crazy request. What they found in just 1 week was impairments in hippocampal dependent learning and memory. So remember that hippocampus, the part of the brain that is essential for learning and memory, and impairment in appetite control, which potentially, this was only a week-long study, but potentially would set you up for a bit of a vicious cycle, because if you're eating something that then makes it difficult for you to manage your appetite, then you're probably going to continue eating those foods. And so round and around and around we go. So potentially something happens in the brain very quickly. And we certainly know that within 8 weeks, I haven't included this study, within 8 weeks, you can get shifts in reward pathways in the brain in response to an intake of high fat and sugar foods that makes, after those 8 weeks, lower fat and sugar alternatives less attractive. That inverse correlation, 55% of our diet as adults in the UK is ultra processed. And that's a little bit higher for children, but 20%, so 1 in 5 UK children get nearly 80% of their daily calories from ultra processed foods. And so when we're thinking again about these brains that are still developing, and they're going to get a majority of their energy from foods that are low in those key nutrients for brain development, this is what I mean about really taking seriously brain nutrition and the way that we think about how we're fueling our brains now. I would quite like my brain to continue being healthy, but also the brains of future generations. And of course, as is always the way with science, it's likely to be a bit of everything, and different factors, of all the factors that I've just mentioned, could be playing out differently for different people. So it's likely to be any one of those, or a combination of all of the above. I will now take your questions, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Kimberley, for your eye-opening talk. I've actually had the pleasure to read your book, which has left me with a lot to consider about my own diet. So thank you for that. So I do like to open up the Q&A to our audience. So please send through your questions using the chat function. I know we've received a couple in so far. And as we just wait for some questions to come through, I just thought I'd kick off the Q&As with my own question, if that's all right. So your book highlights the importance of foods rich in omega-3 for fetal brain development, especially in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So as you know, fish can be very expensive, and it might not be affordable for all mothers. So what would your recommendations be moving forward to mitigate the impact of important yet expensive nutrition for those living in poverty or just more financially constrained?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would have kind of 2 recommendations, and one is kind of direct to the consumer and one is direct to the government. The first one is really, because I think what happens partly with TV, partly with social media, is that we tend to get focused on very specific fish. We tend to think that it needs to be this like beautiful, like fillet of salmon, and it doesn't have to be that. Most of my fish consumption is tin sardines, mackerel, and pilchards, which come in. I think a big can of pilchards is like £1.30, and that will feed a family of 4, and that's your 1 dose of oily fish for the week. So I would say it doesn't have to be, especially if you're not neglecting the important nutrition that are found in canned foods and canned fish, because they are absolutely fine nutritionally. They are economical, they are shelf stable, they are much, much cheaper, and there is nothing wrong with them. So I would, if you're struggling but you're thinking of trying to increase your intake of these foods, canned foods is where I would go. If you can also, and similarly frozen foods, so you can find like bags of kind of frozen whitebait and those sorts of things, that can be really, really helpful. So in that sense, these processes are really helpful in keeping things economical and available. But I think there is a broader issue in terms of the accessibility, and this is what I talk about a lot in the book, and why I do think food is a social justice issue, because we know that it's going to be wealthier mothers, wealthier families that are going to have access to the information about the nutrients that are important for your brain, but then also to be able to afford them. We know even if you're not talking about diet and you're thinking about supplements, the best supplements are going to be more expensive. And so you have this inequality right from the beginning, because if we go back to those first slides that I showed, that diversion in the quality of the diet starts to make, it's like a neurological inequality. Like these babies' brains are different right from the beginning. And I think this is where government has a role to play. Things like Sure Start, ensuring that people are like automatic enrollment into voucher schemes so that those on lower incomes don't have to try and find the right code or card or key or email to get onto these food schemes. I would love to see essentially what I would like the NHS pregnancy supplement, so that there is a standard issue nutritional supplement that contains everything that every woman gets for free as soon as she knows she's pregnant, so that we have a leveling of the playing field when it comes to early nutrition. So I think there's a bit of both. There's kind of, can I be a savvy shopper, but also can my government take seriously these inequalities and do something about them right from the beginning? That's what we'd call leveling up.
Great, super. That was very comprehensive. It was fantastic. Thank you. So now I'm going to take some questions from the audience. So some of the first early questions were also about omega-3. And so questions regarding plant-based diets and whether plant sources are sufficient to meet DHA levels. And if not, how can vegan diets mitigate low levels of omega-3?
Yes, it very much depends on the plant. And this is one of the things, one of the things I think is quite sneaky about supplements that brand themselves as plant-based sources of omega-3, is because they're not really lying, but they're not really telling you the full story. So there are three kinds of omega-3 that we're really interested in for brain health. One is called ALA, then there's EPA, and then there's DHA, that one right at the bottom that I was talking about. EPA is actually really also important anti-inflammatory, but these two, EPA and DHA, are found in fish and seafood, and ALA is found in plants. Now, technically, very, very technically, you can convert ALA into this one, which you need for the brain, but we don't do it very well. We can convert something like 9% of that ALA into DHA. We don't do it we're worse at it when we get older. Certain aspects of your diet will make you worse at it still. So actually it's not a reliable source. And most of the supplements in omega-3, sorry, I will get to answer the question, but most of the supplements you'll read that say, I'm a vegan source of omega-3 are from chia, walnut, flaxseed. They're all ALA. So if you're taking that omega-3 thinking, oh, I want to make sure I'm taking enough omega-3 for my brain, that kind of supplement isn't going to do it. The one that will do it is an algae-based source of DHA, a preformed DHA source from the algae. Because essentially what happens in nature is that the algae synthesize the DHA, fish eat the DHA, concentrate it in their bodies, and then we eat the fish. So you're essentially taking out the middleman and going straight to the original source. But it's an algae-based source of DHA, and you're looking for, in order to meet the recommendations, I think you'd be looking at about, let me double check, 500 milligrams per day of combined EPA and DHA. That's what you'd be looking for from an algae-based source.
Super, thank you. Another question. So the US Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee process have published a report stating there's no conclusive evidence that ultra-processed food causes obesity. So the question is, firstly, are you familiar with this report, and what are your thoughts about this conclusion?
So I'm not familiar with that particular report. I'm not massively surprised, because even in the UK, I will try and I can look at it more from a UK perspective. Even in the UK, some of our largest nutrition informing bodies have quite close links to industry, and they will they will, they will make their case and they will say, oh, you can't, like I was doing, you can't prove that it's this consumption of these foods which are leading to these health outcomes. And technically that's true. We can look at correlations. We can do some RCTs. I presented one of them. In epidemiology, what you have is the Bradford Hill criteria, which were the ones we used for smoking, which is, no, you can't do an RCT. You can't make someone eat something that we think is harmful or smoke something that we think is harmful in order to get an RCT on it. But we can look at these criteria, and if they meet these criteria, then we can say causality. And actually, and I think this is the argument coming from a lot of the people asking for a consensus on ultra-processed foods, this category of foods would meet those criteria. So, I mean, my opinion is that I think there's enough evidence and enough plausible mechanisms, the ones that I presented to you, to say, at least we should probably be not foregrounding these foods. We shouldn't be putting the spotlight on these foods. We shouldn't be driving home the consumption of these foods over what we know to be more nutritious alternatives. Let's just balance the playing field. Let's just say, let's have blueberries on the side of a bus. Let's have broccoli sponsoring the cricket. Let's just make it a bit more fair. Because that's the reality. It's about how the environment is shaped in order for us to make certain choices, but actually the options aren't really there. The options are what makes the difference. But yeah, I kind of wiggled around that question, but I'm not surprised, but I'm not entirely convinced it's relevant. So that's what I say.
Great, thank you. Another question. So, can vitamin supplements provide support for mental health issues? So, whether that is B vitamins, omegas, etc.
Yes and no. So there's a book, it's called The Better Brain. It's by Professors Kaplan and Rutledge. And they go through all of the evidence for really broad spectrum micronutrients, so vitamins, minerals, and omega-3s, and their impact on individual health conditions. So they literally go from A to Z, ADHD, autism, bipolar disorder, and they work all the way through, demonstrating the efficacy of increasing nutritional status on these brain health outcomes, and perhaps only for a subgroup of that condition, not for everybody, but for a subgroup of that condition, or where taking improving nutritional status can improve the efficacy of the medication, so that you can reduce the level of medication, not stop it altogether, but reduce it and have fewer side effects. So I would direct people who are kind of really interested in kind of digging into that question to that book. It's much more comprehensive on it than I can be in these 2 minutes. What we do know is, and there was a meta-analysis published recently. So in the book, I talk about the prison studies, and I left it out here just because there wasn't enough time, but essentially there are RCTs that show that, again, improving nutritional status reduces violence in prison by 30%. And actually, the very first study on that was done here in the UK in 2002 and partly funded by the Home Office, and yet they've done nothing about it. Let's think about that. But now we have a meta-analysis showing that omega-3s do reduce violence by 30%. So what we can say is a couple of things. One, nutrients and an availability, an adequate availability of a broad range of nutrients is essential for brain function. We can say a few things about other key nutrients. So for depression, we know that EPA, so that's second omega-3 found in oily fish and seafood, EPA at about 1 gram a day, as part of a supplement, 1 gram a day where 60% of the supplement is EPA, is associated with improved outcomes in clinical depression. Similarly for aggression. So we have some indications where individual nutrients can have an impact, but I think we need to be broader than that, because we're not kind of doing that same thing with the heart, right? We're not saying, oh, we just need to get everybody having enough vitamin C. We're saying everyone needs to eat a healthy, balanced diet to reduce their risk of heart disease. Everyone needs to have a healthy, balanced diet to reduce their risk of colon cancer. So actually, I think it's more that. It's let's start implementing the same process of prevention that we use in physical health that we do as in mental health. There's no reason that we don't do it, but we don't do it. In mental health, unlike anything else, we wait for something to go wrong first. We wait for someone to have a panic attack. We wait for someone to fall into a depression. We wait for, even worse than that, we wait for something to go wrong. And then we say, oh, let's see if we can draw you back to health. We don't do that with physical health. With physical health, you brush your teeth so that you don't later develop caries and cavities. We tell you to not smoke so that you reduce your risk of then developing lung cancer. And I think this is it, that we need to start treating the brain in the same way. Take care of your diet and exercise, and take care of your sleep and understand your emotions, so that we can start to reduce your risk of this range of common and uncommon mental health conditions which are on the rise and which people are really struggling with. So again, not a direct answer to the question, yes and no. I personally think it can help. I think as an adjunct, so not as a sole treatment, not as a monotherapy. I wouldn't be saying don't have your therapy, just take some supplements, but I would be saying come to therapy. And in fact, I do say come to therapy, but also let's look at your diet. Let's make sure that as we try to do this thing, which is actually growing new connections in your brain, that's what therapy is all about, building new pathways. As we try to help your brain to grow, let's make sure it's got the nutrients it needs to do that.
Great, super, thank you. We only have 3 minutes left until the end of the webinar. I did want to ask another question, but we have unfortunately have run out of time. So I just want to take this opportunity again to thank you, Kimberley, once again for your time and just sharing invaluable insights from your book with us. And I also want to thank the audience for attending. So as a reminder that the recording of this event will be available on the festival's York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival, and you will be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And finally, if you would like to purchase a copy of Kimberley's book, which I really do highly recommend, it is a fantastic book, Unprocessed, it will be available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And I believe a link should be available on the chat for easy access. Thank you everyone for joining us. And take care.
Thank you, everybody. Look after your braids.